Welcome back. It's Patrick McCarthy reporting with Tri-Cities Community Television. We're in our Michael Wright Art Gallery, and today we actually have an artist who's an activist, so it's kind of a perfect place to have a gallery with an artist and activist. Priscilla Omulo, welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
So I guess for us, tell us a bit about, folks out there, a bit about yourself, because we've seen you run for council, we've seen you around, very active, I guess with some of the environmental issues with your camera. I've seen you there. You've got your young son around in a pram and a camera, so it's been quite hectic. So just let the folks out there know a little bit about yourself and what keeps you so busy.
Absolutely, thank you. I find that a good way for me to share my art is through my activism and through trying to share stories and trying to highlight issues that are really important to me. So, I've started with writing and directing, and so doing film is something I'm super passionate about. I've been doing a film about youth environmental movement and how that impacts politics and the last federal election. And yeah, I just keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, I know you. We had you in here a while. You were talking about the lantern, the sort of short story you did, and I know it's about family violence. So it seems to me that you're really focused on, I call it, not to be a humanistic type of topic. Is that kind of what drives you?
It really does. I think that it's a way for me to help highlight issues that are really important, so around family violence and racism, discrimination, the environment itself, and then being able to draw in people. So just trying to say, here are some individual stories and experiences, and then hopefully we can better learn from each other from those. Yeah.
So for folks who don't know, you're First Nations proud, so and of course now we've got First Nations governance in and also environmental protesting or blockades and that kind of stuff. Can you give a sense of, I know people feel like they're confused, I guess, as this concept of hereditary chiefs and council chiefs. Can you give a sense of the folks out there, kind of give us a 101 of really what we should know about this kind of situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and a very common question that's been coming up and kind of simmering for the past couple of years is for people to understand that, elected chiefs are coming from the Indian Act, and they're coming from a colonial perspective in how we've been assigned certain lands. Hereditary chiefs are chiefs that are outside of that elected council, and these hereditary chiefs look after crown land, and so they're responsible for something completely different, but it's also a completely different structure as well. So you take a look at how some are elected and some are hereditary. It's a different way of governing. It's a different belief system even in itself for a lot of our communities.
Yeah, and I guess for me, I always, when I first heard of hereditary chiefs, I was thinking of kings and queens. But at the same time, First Nations, that's a different system that First Nations didn't adopt that. So it's more, tell folks about this kind of the idea of the house or the paternal kind of model that First Nations had before colonialism.
Yeah, so depending on where you're from, so for us in BC, there are certain areas where you would have houses, and you would have, say, the House of the Eagle clan. So there's a clan-based kind of leadership, and so that would be per family. Then you would also have chiefs that would be elected to be like kind of more leadership in those areas, right? And so then they would be the ones who would talk and interact with other areas. So it's a little different in structure, and then matriarchy and patriarchy as well. So a lot of people wonder if you're Indigenous or First Nations, that matriarchy is something that's kind of implied, but that isn't for all First Nations, but it is definitely something that goes into our own pedagogy. So matriarchy isn't something that is women are above men, it's how your community is designed in respecting views and opinions. And matriarchy is just looking at women having a central role in being life givers and being people who are caretakers in the community.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's one of the beautiful things about First Nations culture. I mean, it's not one culture fits all. I mean, I know it changes, but the kind of sense of the elder and sort of, it's kind of crazy. It's like respect your elders, or there's a position of elder, or even the sense of the woman being part of that community. It's not the same for every nation, but it is amazing that in modern times we're struggling with these same things within our own cultures. So. The Indian Act, you hear this a lot, and so real 101. I mean, I know for us, 1867 Canada was made, in 1876 we get the India Act. So just really kind of explain to people really quickly what that really means, the India Act.
I think the Indian Act, I mean, and people are going to have different opinions, right? But for me, the Indian Act is the way of colonization and the oppression and segregation of Indigenous people in a way of being that is completely different. So that told us, you know, who was able to have land, who was able to vote, who was able to go to school. And a lot of those things were things that we weren't allowed to have. And the Indian Act was a way of saying, this is where you're going to be, and this is how you're going to be, in a way that was completely different than what we were used to. And so now, coming with the Indian Act into today, it's trying to break down a lot of the stereotypes and breaking down a lot of that oppression, and then being able to then, yes, integrate into society. So some people say that we want to have abolish the Indian Act. But in abolishing an Indian Act, what you're actually doing is removing a lot of those rights and privileges that were also given with status Indian. So with my status, being a status person, I'm able to get healthcare or education, being able to have my band, be able to have access to funding that we wouldn't have otherwise. But that doesn't mean it's coming from the people. You're not paying into that as a taxpayer. But what it is giving me is a little bit of a leg to stand almost equal. So I think that for myself, abolishing the Indian Act is not something that's going to give me that equal playing field just yet, because as we could see, there's still a lot of oppression and segregation that's happening. And until we're able to, remove racism and discrimination, I don't think that removing that is actually going to do us a lot of justice until there's this decolonization of even our justice and legal system in itself. I think that we're going to create more barriers than we would actually remove.
Yeah, and I bring up the India Act because it kind of, this hereditary chief and the band council, I mean, for me, it's like you had 80 nations in Canada before the Indian Act, and after that, you've got 630 councils that are sort of voted or placed in to manage the funds or the processes coming from the federal government. But I guess at the same time, you know, I was very surprised in like 51. You know, there was a lot of gender-based challenges. If you were female, First Nations, you know, you could have children that were not status. So is that kind of where the bad side of the Indian Act is really what you're referring to?
That is one of the pieces, definitely. You know, if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she would lose status, right? If you were to want to have land, then there's a lot of ways you could lose your status, and losing that status is like losing identity, which I think is challenging for a lot of people, right? So the Indian Act in itself is this way of, you could either own it and say, hey, like myself, who loves to be an advocate, and say, I am a status First Nations woman, right? And I take that history and that colonization, and I do everything I can to address that. Or you could also have the opposite, where a lot of people don't know their lineage and maybe don't want to know because there's a lot of shame in what's connected to that colonization, right?
And then and I know you have some opinions on, you hear this truth and reconciliation, or even now saying that's not reconciliation. What does that mean to you when you hear those words, truth and reconciliation?
I think that the biggest challenge for me, and something that I'm very passionate, is that you need to have truth before you have reconciliation. You know, a reconciliation is about bringing two different beliefs together and finding some kind of common ground, right? Trying to reconcile with things that have happened. And I feel like right now where Canada's at, not enough people know truth to even begin reconciliation. And, you know, right now it's very heated in talking about that reconciliation is dead, because you have a lot of people who are fighting for their basic rights. You have a government provincially that's saying, yes, we have UNDRIP, but yet they're not abiding by what UNDRIP actually is and being able to have those proper consultation, right? So when you're going through these processes in Indigenous relations, it's something that needs to be done consistently and transparently and throughout the entire process, not when it's convenient, right? And that's the hard part of reconciliation, is it's meant to be uncomfortable because it's changing a belief system from what you're used to and merging that with something else that may not be what you believe. How do you do that? And you do that with people feeling respected. That's kind of where we're at, I think, with that question.
Yeah, or as a word, because to me, most people would say, reconciliation. How do you reconcile? I mean, you've got a nation in trauma, as in First Nations, and everybody has their view of what's right and wrong, or what's reconciliation. So I can see your point that it's a word, but it also seems to be a confusing word because you can never actually reconcile, because that's 100% we're all happy, and I don't think that ever happens in human existence. So, and you talked about something that's interesting about blood quantum, and this kind of status is one thing we just talked about, but it's also as a genetic relationship to being First Nations. And as we go through this reconciliation process, there's a lot of benefits to now being First Nations. And where before, if you were in First Nations, there's a lot of things you didn't want to be First Nations because it was a lot of pain. So how do you round that circle with blood quantum, and what's your general thoughts about that? And I know I'm put you on the spot, so I apologize. Okay. You'll offend some people, even me, I'm sure. But give a sense of what blood quantum means to you, and we're talking genetics and sort of status and just things about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that a part of where my answer comes from is understanding that with reconciliation, like you said, there are a lot of funding available that's happening right now, whether it be with post-secondary or federal funding for other businesses and programming. So when people are applying for that, being able to show that blood quantum or being able to get status, whether it be First Nation status or Métis status, right? Because Métis have their own carded system. There has been a lot of conflict around, well, how do you know with what blood quantum you have, is that something that you should be able to own and be able to share with the world and walk your journey in a different way, and for some of us, I say some of us because I've talked with some people who have similar views that I do, is that we are not able to change our skin tone, change the way our life has went, our journey has went, because of the racism and oppression and residential schools. So we have a different life experience because of things that are out of our control. So for blood quantum, I feel like you absolutely have a right to know where your heritage comes from. And for some people, I think, who were passable as being white because of physical appearance, chose that journey because of the racism that had happened historically, and therefore find out generations down, yes, this is who I am, I'm Cree, I'm Métis, I'm from this area. Then trying to find who you are, I find that to be genuine and authentic and something that could be celebrated, because you're gaining this insight to where your hardship has come from, where your life has come from. But if you're doing it in a way because it's not really something that you connect to, and you're doing it to be able to gain financial gains or some kind of prestige that comes with it now, then I feel like you're doing us all a disservice, because there are those of us who fight every day to have access to these rights and have access to be able to be treated equally. And if you're just taking and ticking that box for other reasons other than a genuine understanding of the history and culture and who you are.
Annoyed by it.
I am annoyed by it, and I'm hurt by it, actually. I think that's what it is. I'm hurt and I'm frustrated because I want someone like my son, who is First Nations and Kenyan, to know where he comes from, and to know, that we have fought to get to where we're at today, and that there are people who take advantage of that, as you do with any system, I guess, that's in place, right? But think about it again, right? What you're doing to us when you're doing that.
So is there anything, we could talk all day, because I find this, it's almost like the awareness, the truth part is what we're hearing through the media or even some of this activism, and I hope we covered off some points here that were basic points that, but is there anything you want to pass on to folks before we close out? Anything that's really, it wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you yell at the ceiling?
Yes, there's a lot of that.
Yeah, well, give us one of them.
I think one of them is keep seeking the truth. I think that one of the biggest challenges right now with a lot of the protests that are happening is people are thinking, oh wait, this is just another movement, and there are some people who are doing this who don't know what they're doing it for. Whether either be the truth, learn that truth, find out what it is, find out the history of colonization and what's happened, learn more about the Indian Act, learn more about what's happening really with UNDRIP and what that means, truth and reconciliation, and what those points in there mean, right? Because you can't have this government process and then parallel have these Indigenous rights and then not have them bridge and possibly conflict with each other and have that affect community. If you do it and it doesn't affect community, then what's the actual change that's happening, right? These protests are disruptive for a reason because they want people to better see and understand what's happening. And I feel like if people better educated themselves as to the root of the cause and not just how it impacts them, that we might actually get to a better place in Canada with actual reconciliation because you're learning truth.
Well, again, I want to thank you very much for coming in. You should come in more often. I think we just focus on First Nations 101 to help people like me just kind of in that truth process. So I do want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
So there you go. It's kind of truth and reconciliation. Part of it is more about the truth and learning. I was very interested to know that 25 years ago we had a Canadian sort of review on Indigenous rights and self-governance. So 25 years, that's been sitting in the books. It's been around probably a few $1 million to put together. So there's lots to learn in this process. It's not a simple black and white or us and them question. It's really one that's a bit complex, but also very enlightening to us as humans to understand more about ourselves. Again, this is Patrick McCarthy reporting with Tri-Cities Community Television. Thank you very much for watching.